It is time to try and understand why so many people choose to believe that the Red Sea crossing wasn't through the deep Gulf of Aqaba, but rather through a shallow, marshy lake within Egypt itself. We find that there are actually several proposed crossing sites in northeast Egypt. This includes the small bay at the south inlet of the current-day Suez Canal, the many shallow lakes along its border, and a lagoon, a pier along the Mediterranean Sea. The reasons for this are many, and I will try and touch upon them all. For one, scholars have convinced themselves that they have found Pi Hahiroth, Baal Zephon, and Migdol of Exodus 14:2, and that all three are in the Nile Delta. Secondly, they teach that the turn at Etham in Exodus 14:2 is northwards, not southwards. This point is critical because it is the only way to get the congregation of Israel near their proposed sites.
And the destination that we will try to get the Israelites to is the name of the sea or the body of water they pass through.
Then we are led to believe that this large group got lost in their own Nile Delta backyard, and that this flat agricultural area somehow shut them in. That's Exodus 14, verse 3. The Delta is a large region, but almost all scholars agree with the Bible saying it is not a wilderness. Their story continues with Pharaoh chasing them into a body of water they call the Sea of Reeds, or Pa Tufi. This non-specific reference is from a letter that a scribe wrote to another scribe during the Ramesside period. They were simply describing a marsh nearby that has reeds growing around it. For some reason, it was important for the scribe to know about this watery marsh in planning an upcoming event. So we need to look closer at the highbrow reasoning within the academic world. How did they come up with this? It appears to have started about 100 years ago and has been an echo chamber ever since. It is only a few from the Bible-believing community that challenge the status quo on this theme. Thankfully, scholars such as J.K. Hoffmeyer and Bryant Wood and others have given various lectures on this topic, and these lectures provide a window into the artful line of thinking one has to be led through to reach such a conclusion. It is actually an argument that Bible believers don't waste their time on. The reason for this is because the Bible clearly states that Pharaoh allowed Israel to leave Egypt. We see this stated emphatically in Exodus 13, verse 18, Numbers 33, 1, and that the exit was after Sukkoth. Exodus 13:20, Numbers 33, 6 also add support. Dr. Fritz says it best when he doesn't even answer these gentlemen because they are purposely ignoring what Scripture says.
But to me, the question is immaterial because they were allowed to leave. The Pharaoh said to go ahead and leave, and they took with them the jewelry and gifts from the other Egyptians, and they left without any sort of military resistance. And people say, well, they had to avoid these forts along the border of Egypt. That doesn't mesh because Pharaoh let them go.
And I guess me trying to respond, I'm falling into the trap of Proverbs 26, verse 4. Yikes. The bright side is that almost all agree that the first day of the Exodus began from Pi Ramses. That's Numbers 33, 5. There was a mass movement of people walking the 20 miles from Ramses to Sukkoth. Israel would then be in the large, shallow wadi extending to the east, where they would have joined many other fellow Hebrews who lived there. The time of growing crops was over, and they had amassed much bread and grain for the trip. It is after this point in the story where we find serious deviations from the biblical narrative.
It's very difficult. What I'm trying to do is provide, to look at all the geographical names we have and see where they.
The initial trick is to define the Red Sea as any body of water that has reeds. Thus, the Nile could be the Sea of Reeds. but because it is not in the sequential path that Moses described in Numbers 33 and Exodus 14, it is not used. After all, reeds were present where baby Moses was set afloat in a wicker basket of bulrushes amongst the shores of the Nile.
Read about how the mother of Moses took the baby, made a basket, and then placed the basket with the baby in the water amongst the reeds. And that word reeds is our word Suph.
Hoffmeyer drives his point home by showing several non-specific texts that include the designation of Yam Suph, or Sea of Reeds, but cleverly doesn't include the one text that tells us exactly where the Sea of Reeds is located. That text is 1 Kings 9:26. I've been to Eliat Aqaba, and I didn't see any reeds there, just a sea. Unless these are some reeds in front of the Kempinski Hotel. But that is what you would expect, because reeds don't grow in salt water. Hoffmeyer and Wood, of course, overlooked the fact that Yam is primarily used in the Bible as a very large body of water. See Genesis 1, verse 10, Ezekiel 27:3, and over 300 others. He also does a smoke and mirrors trick with the second proof text of Yam Suph's location by implying that billions and billions of locusts that invaded the entire river system of the Nile were blown all the way to Goshen into tiny Patufi. Listen to this.
One other indication provided by the Bible itself. I'm giving this translation since we're meeting in a Roman Catholic facility. This is the New Jerusalem translation, which is a Roman Catholic translation. So, and this is what it says. This is when the plague of locusts covered Egypt. And God was going to get rid of the locust. Yahweh changed the wind to a west wind, very strong, which carried the locust away and swept them into the Sea of Reeds. That's why I use this translation. It translates Yam Suph as Sea of Reeds, not Red Sea. So the locusts were blown away from Ramesses and the delta and were swept into the Sea of Reeds. So here's Ramesses, here's our locusts, and there's the Sea of Reeds. Boom, right in there.
Okay, so he handpicks a translation that uses the Sea of Reeds. The only problem is that he didn't read the whole text. There was not one locust left in the whole of Egypt. Patufi is in Egypt. Recall the plague of locusts was not in Goshen, but all along the Nile from the delta south. So the only body of water that the locusts could have been blown into was not a tiny shallow lake of reeds here, but rather the western arm of the Red Sea. If locusts blew into Patufi, then sadly all the reeds would have been eaten down to the roots. Furthermore, it is critical to understand that Israel left Egypt in the dry harvest season of Shamu. So there would be minimal amounts in the lake system that the scholars say were fed by tributaries of the Nile. Suph is indeed related to the Egyptian word for reeds, but keep in mind that the Hebrew language has its own word for reeds or bulrushes. See Isaiah 19 verse 6 or Exodus 2 verse 3. They are gome and kana. So if Moses clearly understood that the Red Sea was the Reed Sea, he could have used a Hebrew word for reeds, but he used the local colloquial Egyptian name. I will postulate why he did that shortly, but for now, the most important point to understand is that scholars cannot use the Bible to prove Patufi as the Red Sea. Moving on. Because these learned men have defined Yam Suph as this tiny lake system that is situated near many surrounding forts, and because there's some evidence that there was a mouth to a canal in the area, it followed that Hoffmeyer and Wood and many others then needed to have a way to get Israel up to this area to march to Patufi. Which brings us back to the biased motive for putting Etham on the western edge of the wilderness instead of on the correct eastern edge over here, as Numbers 33:8 demands. The word atum in Portuguese is tuna fish. I only know this because I tried to order a tuna fish sandwich in Brazil, but got a chicken sandwich, frango. So it is here in Wadi Tumilat, something really fishy.
So again, Wadi Tumilat preserves the name of Atum, who is described as the lord of Cheku. Cheku is the Egyptian name. The Hebrew name of Cheku is Sukkot, and this survives into Arabic as Mashuta. Okay?
There's really something fishy about how these scholars don't actually put a tomb on the edge of the wilderness of Sinai, or the correct position of Etham on the edge of the wilderness of Etham, but they put it right beside Sukkoth. If it was actually on the edge here, then Israel would have skirted up the desert to avoid all the swamps and tributaries of the delta in a true effort to get to Patufi. Either way, this theory has them going towards the way of the Philistines, or the way of Horus, in which God specifically forbade and didn't lead them, Exodus 14:17, even though it was near. Hofmeyr himself has stated in this summary article that there is absolutely no reason for Israel to have turned north. So we have to conclude that this northward turn is a non-biblical event made up by scholars to get Israel near this tiny shallow marsh, and additionally, it requires an Etham to be put in the wrong place. Hofmeyr goes on to say that even if they left Egypt at this designated Etham Atum site, it would still be a very difficult trek through lakes, marshes, forts, and sand to be on their way. So if it was so bad in Hofmeyr's mind about going a short distance east, then can you imagine how much worse it would be for the throng to begin a northward slog within the East Nile Delta to get all the way up to here? Taking this point further, where would they camp in such a high water table swamp? Exodus 14:9. Like I previously said, the lakes most likely had minimal water or none because it was the dry season. Exodus 13:18 highly suggests Moses was trying to avoid encountering Pharaoh's forces, so it defies logic that they would go to an area with numerous fortifications, loaded with infantrymen surrounding them. It wouldn't take many foot soldiers that are found on the east, west, and south to easily entrap them. Patufi would provide no escape route. Let me say that again. When armies have you encircled, they don't pursue. They just chop you down. Pharaoh's men could easily have gone around this swamp. They had no reason to venture into this lake marsh. I would also like to add that there would be no need for chariots in such a scenario, other than to kill Hebrews faster. Hofmeyr speaks of Pharaoh having hundreds of horses nearby to pull his chariots.
Ancient stable where the horses were kept, the royal horse stables.
But why saddle up horses or launch chariots into this area since it is so close? A disciplined army can march 20 miles a day, easily overtaking a feeble group going only 7 miles per day, as stated by Dr. Wood.
Well, there's one other fact that I should mention right away, and that is travel time. How far could the Israelites travel in one day with thousands upon thousands of people, their animals, their little kids, their elderly?
Yeah.
6 miles a day is about it for a large group of people.
Seems logical.
Napoleon marched his armies 400 to 500 miles, averaging 12.5 miles a day. Armies can top out at 30 miles if necessary. So, no chariots were needed to chase Israel around Patufi. Okay, back to how the academic world heavily emphasizes Suph or reeds. Then by using the Anastasis III papyrus notation, they can assure us that Patufi is the Red Sea. That papyrus was written in Semitic Egyptian and does connect the words reeds with Patufi, which is most likely the Bala Lake system or Lake Timsah. The papyrus also talks about a mouth of a canal, in which they believe is the word Pi Hahiroth.
Pi Perhairoth,
as noted in Exodus 14, verse 2. A canal is believed to exist later that connected to a lagoon here on the Mediterranean Sea. I again remind you that reeds can only tolerate salt water for short periods. If exposed a long time, they will die. Furthermore, reeds do best with only 6 inches of water above their ground level stem, or 6 inches below. The word for ocean sea is not found on the Anastasis papyrus. These scholars have effectively ruled out the current-day Red Sea to be Yam Suph by making freshwater reeds as the all-important critical element in defining Yam Suph. No loss. Scholars have been very excited about this point since 1931 and remain so, even though they all have been exposed concerning their weak arguments. As you can see, their path is based on many flawed assumptions. Let me list them. The Septuagint translators didn't fall for this interpretation, nor should a thinking person. It is safer to hypothesize that the word Suph, as represented by the glyphs used at the time, had a much deeper and more profound meaning than just reeds growing along a marsh. Betek, Gardner, Wood, Hoffmeyer, and many others do not believe that they have gone wrong by fixating on this link. But what if they have not been able to see the greater meaning and imagery of Suph, or simply refused to do so? I see it as very elementary to superficially conclude that dictionary symbols of one reed, which represents Suph Chufa reeds, when combined with water and canal symbols as found on the unimportant Anastasis letter describing a marshy lake, that this is somehow equivalent to the Rosetta Stone, telling us exactly where the Red Sea is. No, there isn't ancient Greek or hieroglyphs to back it up. They have traded something majestic for the pitiful and pathetic. So let's explore this further by considering why Septuagint translators correctly went with Erythra thalassa instead of the Sea of Reeds. I will shortly have you see in red. It is actually both stunning and telling that 70 scholars who lived 2,200 years ago could agree on naming this vital body of water. Not surprisingly, Hoffmeyer calls this a mystery.
The word red is Eruthra, and that's what the Septuagint translates this as Erythra thalassa, the Red Sea. So why did the Greek translators translate Reed Sea as Red Sea? We don't know. It's clearly they didn't translate it.
He states that this was a biased interpretation and not an appropriate translation. Wood goes further and says that they had to change it because the second Reed Sea encounter found in Exodus 33 verse 10 was not Patufi, but rather along the Gulf of Suez. In fact, Wood believes that the Septuagint writers did this to exaggerate what happened and thus make the Exodus more awesome. Listen to this interview.
Some people have been concerned of you're taking away from the miraculous nature of this event, or the Red Sea. That's a big body of water.
Bala Lake.
Yes.
Jim Hoffmeyer estimates it probably was 30 feet deep. Now it's not the Mediterranean.
Right.
It's not the Gulf of Suez. As you say, we have an idea in our mind, some monster body of water, but it doesn't matter how big it is.
I'll tell you what is bad. It's when you get both the translation wrong and the interpretation. Let me explain. Wood doesn't mention how words and places can change over time based on many factors. If it was a visual characteristic that changed, like the yellow sea getting its name from the yellow color of the mineral-rich soil, or the Black Sea having black mud at the bottom making it look black on stormy days, that's possible. I do not believe this is the case with the Red Sea, even though you find red coral, red sandstone silt, and bacterial blooms from a red form of cyanobacteria called Trichodesmium erythraeum, along its shores. I have seen the red coral at Sharm el-Sheikh. No, it's not this. It's deeper. The imagery of Suph goes to the core of Egypt's history. So we need to go way back and look at something from that time. Thus, we need to look at the Palermo stone. This is perhaps the most important artifact found that defines Egypt. The stone itself is shaped like a shield. It is 43.5 centimeters high, 25 centimeters wide, and 6.5 centimeters thick. The writing on the front of the stone is 6 lines of hieroglyphs. The first line lists the names of the early dynastic period kings of Lower Egypt from 3000 BC onwards. The kings are described as wearing the red crown. What is interesting, there is no descriptor for red or white when the glyphs for Egypt's 2 crowns are mentioned. You simply know the lower crown is red and the upper crown is white. Later, a blue war crown was introduced. When Upper and Lower Egypt was united, the 2 crowns were combined, but it remained mostly red, with the white milk bottle-looking feature in the middle. Now, these crowns have never been found, but yet we know they are red from many statues and inscriptions. If the founding pharaohs of Egypt wore a red crown, then a body of water along its shores would be under the red crown. The red crown was made of red reeds. I grew up in Canada. When we describe land within Canada that is owned by the government, we call it Crown land. When I was born, a great flag debate began in Canada, and the Francophones of Canada won the arguments for a new flag by promoting the maple leaf. These leaves come from a tree that was found in abundance in the new land. Though leaves of this tree are primarily green, when fall comes, they turn a brilliant red. My many Canadian friends who I grew up with would see the imagery and understand this point. If we Canadians see a black and white leaf, it is red in our heads. If we see a blue maple leaf, it's still red. Why? Because Paul Henderson, who played for the Toronto Maple Leafs at the time, scored the winning goal against the Russians for Team Canada in 1972. China could be called Red China or Communist China. It's the same thing. The South China Sea to the Chinese is like the Red Sea. In ancient Egypt, reeds growing along the Nile were like maple trees. There are 2 parts to the reed, the stem and the panicle. It's not a leaf. This has been mistranslated, misinterpreted, and the imagery is often posted wrong in hieroglyph texts. Most images from ancient Egypt include the panicle, not the stems. It was this feature that turned from white to red with seasonal change. In Lower Egypt, Egyptians probably noticed the panicles to begin turning red earlier than Upper Egypt. We find that the hieroglyph depicting a reed is not the stem, but rather the panicle of the reed. This is the life-giving portion of plants that we know as grain. Scholars of the last 100 years don't consider this. They just see the word reed. But Egyptians saw mostly red in their minds due to the Desheret, the crown of Lower Egypt, and because of panicles growing along the Nile. We simply see a statue here, but an ancient would see a blue crown when viewing this statue. There is definitely unseen color behind hieroglyphs, and there is even more than just words and color to conceptualize. An ancient Egyptian would also view the reed as a form of power and dominion. The king of Lower Egypt, wearing the red crown, would be lord over the sea that surrounded Egypt. When Moses floated among the reeds of the Nile, he was under the jurisdiction of the red and white crown of combined Egypt. This concept of power and dominion is reflected through the red reeds of the red crown. This is further supported by an extraordinary mural found in the tomb of Entrapment in Luxor, Egypt. He lived during the 20th dynasty, and his tomb has a stunning depiction of a reed used as a weapon. I'd love it if Andrew led a tour to see this tomb. What you see here is not a knife. It is not a feather. No, it is a red reed in the hands of Ra. Ra has taken the form of a cat to kill an enemy god, Apophis, who is found in the form of a snake. This imagery is reminiscent of Genesis 3:15. Perhaps this foundational dynamic between good and evil had indeed entered into Egyptian mythology. We have learned from other videos that the Hebrew family word for Suph, the ancient cognates, could include boundary, destruction, or an end. A red reed brought the end or destroyed this god Apophis. Either way, this mural gives support to Moses' choice of words in naming the Red Sea. It all fits. It supports his respect of Egypt's symbols in naming internal and external topography, despite the possibility of future scholars getting confused. At the same time, the word fits perfectly with the Hebrew word families. The Red Sea indeed was a boundary, and it was the destruction of Pharaoh. So just as the Anastasis III papyrus is a type of proof text for Patufi or Pachufi, this mural is a proof depiction of reeds conveying the color red and all the imagery that goes with it. Ezekiel 29:3 talks of a monster crocodile of the Nile, Pharaoh, a sea serpent, and his power did die in the Red Sea from a red reed. It was a judgment sent from Jehovah God. That judgment was the opening and closing of the Red Sea. Good triumphed over evil. This analysis is much more than semantics. It is reality. It is history. It includes considering both the forest, which is the Red Sea, and the trees, the reeds. Our Egyptologist friends only see the trees. Recognizing the true Red Sea requires viewing the reeds, panicles, marsh, ocean, crowns, and more. In medicine, we encounter many people who have much trouble moving beyond literal thinking and viewing symbols with imagination or abstract thought. We say such people are stuck in concrete operations. It's a stage defined by the great Swiss psychologist Jean Piaget. Most of the scholars out there are ABC 1, 2, 3, literal interpretation types of people. They would never dare alter a recipe when cooking. They cannot move beyond mere semantics that has joined them at the hip with Patufi as the Red Sea. Sadly, this interpretation has caused much damage. It is no wonder many call the Exodus a myth or hoax. Hundreds of men and women of faith that have made the trip to Egypt and tried to make sense of these erroneous sites, but have been unable to do so. Perhaps they lost their faith in the effort. There have been thousands who have searched for Mara in vain beyond Patufi. Yet, an amazing Mara site has now been found at the mouth of the largest wadi in northwest Arabia. Sadly, over here along the Gulf of Suez, all you find within a 2 days' journey is a tiny contaminated well. Then, if dedicated and desperate, Bible tourists then look for a larger oasis with many date palm trees and springs of water that is supposed to be found after Mara. Dejectedly, they find only rocks and sand. So then, they go over to the old turquoise mines to cheer up. Andrew Jones showed me the true Mara in Elam in November of 2019, and I've never looked back. The excitement and joy of seeing these places has ignited a fire within both of us to share them with all we can. You can find everything at the true Red Sea crossing site. There is a fort. There is an incredible mouth of the gorge of Wadi Watir,
Pi Hahiroth,
or to be more accurate, gorges. And yes, directly across, there is the land where Baal was worshipped. Andrew Jones recently discovered an old Northwest Arabia map listing current-day Al-Sharaf as Baal Sharaf. Some say Zephon was a grandson of Esau. Some say Baal Zephon was a pagan worship site, and eventually a mountain was named after him. We find that the wilderness path down through Wadi Watir truly shuts you in, as stated in Exodus 14 verse 3. It is glorious compared to the flat Nile Delta, and there's lots of water within this wadi. Israel didn't go north from here, but south to reach the shore of the true Red Sea. We have to conclude that Pa-Tufi and its aftermath of fake sites is a concocted myth and should be discarded by both the academic and religious world. The academic world has to quit hitting us over the head with archaeology. Digging in the ground has very limited application when applied to the Exodus event, because it's an event that would not leave evidence in the ground. Whereas the discipline of applied geography triumphs in validating all that Moses wrote concerning those first 45 days. The Exodus was real. It was not a myth.
Pi Hahiroth.